Pilots of Reddit, what has been a scary moment of which the passengers were blissfully unaware? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. Late as fuck, but my dad once had one engine quit on his Embraer. Didn't even tell the passengers if I remember correctly. He also told me a story of a Super 80, I think, that literally lost an engine. The pilots were like, shit, engine 2 stopped working, but after a passenger spoke to a flight attendant, the flight attendant let the pilot know that they had in fact, literally lost it, it fell off. Can't remember the deets. But I'd love to be the passenger in the back window seat and suddenly getting to actually have a view instead of only seeing an engine. Probably will get buried, but whatever. I was giving a ride to a friend in a rental Cessna 172F. It was late in the day and the sun was going down. The airport I was heading to was only about 15 nautical miles away, but it was on the other side of a large body of water. We taxi up to the run-up pad and I test the engine like I do before every flight. Everything seems to look fine and normal. I taxi onto the runway, make my final checks, and proceed to take off. At that point I detect a small unusual vibration. I brushed it off like it was nothing. Small old airplanes vibrate all the time, so it's no surprise. As I'm climbing out, I'm looking at the tachometer and I glance down at the oil pressure and it's measuring lower than normal. I decide to turn base into an upwind. Pilot talk for turn around while still in airport airspace, for the departure airport rather than riding it out over the lake. We're at about 1700 MSL, 800 feet AGL, when the oil pressure falls below allowable limits. At this point I'm freaking out in my head because shit's getting real fast. My passenger doesn't know anything is up because I'm not saying anything. The last thing I need is some guy freaking the hell out while I'm trying to land the plane without a usable engine. I calmly tell him, we need to turn around. My assumption is that I'm pissing oil and I'm at a risk of fire, so I get on the Unicom, airport radio frequency, and declare an emergency landing. The others in the pattern exit and I end up doing right traffic to final. I pull the throttle to prevent any fire as I turn base to final while keeping enough airspeed to keep from stalling and crashing. I end up doing the approach too fast and landed the airplane on the last 500 feet of the runway, nearly running off the end. I pull to the taxiway and shut the engine down. Turns out the engine was grinding and making metal on the inside. Probably first time I was thankful for how excellent my instructors were when I was training. TLDR. Lost my engine during takeoff, saved the airframe, and my passenger had no goddamn clue what was going on. Military pilot here. Can't speak for my commercial bros, but most things that break are minor, and for the more serious shit your pilot is more than overqualified to handle it. From my experience sharing airspace with the bus drivers, most airliners will take precautions to make sure a bad Tatuan, though minor, doesn't get worse. My buddy's flight across the pond came back for a bad smell in the cockpit. Maybe something is burning, maybe somebody had a particularly acrid fart, who knows. Most times my crew is unaware the particulars of how close we came to smashing that bird I narrowly avoided. Could count the feathers on that fucker. A little off topic, but as a passenger on a flight from LAX to the main island of Hawaii on United Flight 83, I plugged my earbuds into the armrest and found the channel that let you listen to the pilots talking to the tower. About 100 miles out, they were getting in line and the tower called us United 93. I got a cold chill, the pilots murmured, the tower called back referring to us as United 83, and everything moved along. I could just tell that anyone involved with that conversation just felt sick. Not a pilot, but I was once a passenger on a particularly scary landing in New Orleans. We were flying through the darkest, scariest rainstorm I could imagine, with a lot of turbulence. It was scary enough that we just seemed to keep turning and turning, but I couldn't see the end of the wing out the window due to the rain. When the wheels hit pavement and we started toward the gate, everyone started turning on their cell phones. It was like a great chorus went up as each one connected and immediately made the tornado alert sound. We'd landed during a tornado warning. Late to the game on this one, but I was a passenger on a pretty scary flight experience. I was coming back into LaGuardia from Florida late at night. Most of the people on the plane were asleep when the loudspeaker comes on and the pilot literally yells, "Everyone be seated and buckle up." That was it. Everyone was wide awake and the flight attendants were obviously rattled. Within 30 seconds the plane nosedived, which is the worst feeling ever. This continued until we were mere feet above buildings in Atlantic City. I remember thinking we could jump out on top of the Borgata and be fine. At this point everyone is crying and on their phones and the stewardesses are freaking out. Everyone thought the plane was hijacked as we were heading towards NYC. Of course, as luck would have it, we also landed on the runway at LaGuardia that is right on the edge of the water, and it looks like you're going to crash into the water. While we were pulling into the gate, the pilot finally came over the loudspeaker again apologizing for the disturbing flight as the windshield shattered at 25,000 feet and they had to nosedive to avoid the cabin losing pressure. Scary shit. For anyone who's curious, there is an interesting series called Mayday Air Crash Investigation, which details many of the terrible crashes and accidents over the years. I have a terrible fear of flying, but honestly seeing these and how they corrected the issues has helped me to get over it. So many safety issues were corrected and created to solve the problems over the years. But some of them still just horrify me. A few of my college roommates were commercial pilot majors. It was not uncommon to be woken up on a Saturday and told we are flying 6 states away today. One particular time I remember being about 10,000 feet over the Mississippi River when my friend Paul says, "Hey, look at that," just before stalling the engine and falling 1,000 feet in a matter of seconds. All the while he is fighting the choke, and I watched as the propeller stopped. It is not a good feeling to have been flying for 3 hours with the constant roar of the plane engine not 4 feet in front of you, to sudden engine silence and the deafening roar of wind going by as you are falling hundreds of feet per second. Freaked the fuck out of me, but apparently retarding a stalled aircraft is something you must do to get a license. He did it 3 more times that day. Small plane pilot, so no passengers. But here is the story of why I don't fly with my friend who owns a plane anymore. 1. Friend decides that clouds traditionally only exist over this particular airport, like the clouds over the Addams family house, and we can get out no problem. I went along and we ended up in total whiteout, inadvertent IMC conditions. Coulda died. Ended up landing 150 miles from home, staying in a Days Inn where 75% of rooms rented by pimps. 2. Fly down the coast to Florida? Sure. End up scud running the coast of Maryland, almost hitting a Ferris wheel, had to get special clearance through military space, Wallops, to maintain marginal at best VFR. 3. Flying across Florida. 9 a.m. is great, no problems, but T-storms pop around midday like clockwork. Dude refuses to get up, motivate to do the flight early. End up taking off around 11:30 a.m. End up under Orlando's Class B airspace, heavies above, and the best part? We get caught in an updraft, almost stall out and spend 40 minutes weaving through thunderheads, because we have onboard weather. 4. Again, drags his feet for on-time departure. End up at airport and he wants to go. Lightning strikes on the field and reported downbursts in the vicinity. But it stops raining and he's all, "Let's go." He jawboned tower into taxiing us out when they didn't want. Then watched a tree at one end of the airport get zapped from the cockpit before tower chased us back to the FBO saying, "Don't let me hear from you for at least 2 hours." I spent a ton of money to get my pilot's license and fly with a friend who is lucky enough to have a plane. Decided I prefer living. Probably won't use my license again until I hit the lottery. But I'm alive after all his shenanigans, and my own stupidity not standing up for proper safety and ADM. And that's probably used up all my odds beating karma. I'm an airline captain based out of LAX. Little late to the party here, but this is a good story that meets the criteria for this post. On a commercial aircraft, you generally have 3 sources of bleed air that take air from the engines, and a little device in the back of the airplane called the APU, and use it to pressurize the cabin. You can't breathe the air at 35,000 feet, so the cabin is pressurized by these bleed air sources to a breathable altitude of at or below 8,000 feet. There are 3 sources because 1. Redundancy increases safety, and 2. You can still dispatch the airplane as one as an op because there are backups. One of the bleed sources, on the number 2 engine, was already broken, so maintenance deferred it, indicating we were still safe to fly on the remaining 2 sources. Which is totally fine. You just take off with the APU running as a backup bleed source. Well, on the takeoff roll, immediately after becoming airborne, our APU fails. Which leaves us with just one bleed source to pressurize the cabin, the bleed air from the number 1 engine. If that fails, we have nothing to keep the air inside the cabin pressurized to a lower altitude than the airplane is flying at. You won't be able to breathe at high altitudes. It's a short flight, and we aren't going up too high, so I'm optimistic that we can get up to our low cruising altitude, message dispatch and maintenance, and receive their agreement that the flight is safe to continue on one bleed source. I text our company a message describing the situation via ACARS, a satellite-based texting capability our aircraft has to communicate with people on the ground. But they never had the chance to get back to us. Passing through 25,000 feet, I feel the air getting sucked out of my lungs. I'm trying to inhale, but it isn't working, and my lungs are emptying quickly. Unable to breathe normally, immediately my eyes shoot to the cabin altitude gauge, which is showing us at 8,000 feet cabin altitude and rising quickly. In fact, it is rising at the exact same rate of climb as our airplane, indicating the airplane has lost all pressurization capabilities and is depressurizing rapidly. At that instant, we get a warning chime and message on our EICAS, Engine Information and Crew Alerting System, essentially a computer screen that tells us when shit goes wrong, that says Bleed 1 fail. With our Bleed 1 source now failed, our OPU having failed on the takeoff roll, and Bleed 2 already deferred, we are completely out of ways to pressurize the aircraft. If we don't descend to a safe altitude immediately, the cabin altitude will rise high enough that the air is no longer breathable. This is a serious problem. High cabin altitude killed everyone on board, Helios Airways Flight 522, and there are countless other examples of depressurization causing injuries and fatalities. Immediately I throw off my sunglasses and headset, and don my full-face oxygen mask and smoke goggles. It provides 100% pure oxygen under a forced flow, rated up to an altitude of 41,000 feet. My first officer does the same. This is the first thing you do because if the pilots die, there is nobody to fly the jet and everyone else dies. Then we immediately declare an emergency and initiate an emergency descent, nosing over to our maximum speed while deploying the speed brakes to generate maximum drag. We receive clearance down to 10,000 feet and begin executing a 180-degree turn to go back to LAX. ATC does a fantastic job vectoring aircraft out of our way. SoCal airspace is some of the busiest in the world, but we got priority handling all the way back to LAX. The cabin altitude nearly reached hazardous levels, but didn't go high enough for the oxygen masks in the cabin to automatically deploy. It was definitely high enough that the passengers would have noticed, but wouldn't have had a concrete idea of what was going on aside from, "That's odd." The cabin also got quite hot because there was no more pressurized, conditioned air flowing to cool it off. We landed at LAX on the longest runway with the fire trucks rolled to assist us, just in case. Fortunately, none of the passengers or crew reported any injuries from the sudden increase in cabin altitude. We parked at the gate and deplaned, and I made an announcement to the passengers about what had just happened, using small words and downplaying everything so as not to scare the shit out of everyone. 12 Chinese passengers on our flight were on a West Coast tour, and they were very upset that their trip was inconvenienced by this emergency. No problem, I totally understand the frustration. So I spoke to their translator, who spoke in turn to her group, and I gave her the full and very detailed explanation of what happened. As I explained what happened, the expressions on these 12 passengers' faces went from angry, to surprised, to fearful, and finally thankful. Before I walked away, all 12 of them bowed to me in respect. That was something I have never experienced before or since then in my entire aviation career. We ended up swapping airplanes to one that wasn't sick, and completed the flight as planned about 3 hours behind schedule. I slept well that night, and the passengers probably went on to complain about their flight being delayed several hours due to a maintenance issue, smiley face. Not a pilot, but I was a passenger when I overheard a flight attendant speaking to another saying, "They're gonna try flying over it." Shortly after, the pilot announced we would be experiencing some turbulence from a nearby storm. They weren't kidding. That shit hit the plane so hard we had to make an emergency landing in Louisiana. Apparently some electronics were damaged, so we had to switch planes. Haven't flown in a few years, but I had my PPL for a couple years and only had a few incidents worthy of a story. On my second ever solo, while I was still a student pilot, I hit a pocket of air right after takeoff that threw my head into the ceiling hard enough to make me a little dizzy. Never told anyone about that. First trip home after getting me PPL, I was taxiing the plane to park and nearly took out a fence while my parents were watching me. I acted like I meant to get the wing within inches of it when my dad brought up how close I was. One time I had a guy in a helicopter completely cut in front of me right after I was given clearance to take off. I had just pushed the throttle in, so it wasn't really close. But the best part of it was hearing the traffic controller lose his shit on the heli pilot. I miss flying. Not a pilot, but I do work for an airline. I was doing a project at our base in LGA, and had to fly home to my native Indianapolis, and my only option was to deadhead with a few crew members from my airline back home. I was sitting by myself in first class on an empty plane, save for one pilot, 3 flight attendants, plus the 2 guys flying the plane. Upon landing, we hit the runway really hard and bounced. I didn't think anything of it, as I've flown on airplanes hundreds of times. However, the captain flying the plane looked white as a ghost, and told me he almost flipped us.